Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kevin Moss. I'm a policy advisor here at the Western Governors Association. Welcome to today's webinar on broadband deployment in tribal communities. This webinar is being held as part of North Dakota Governor Burgum's Reimagining the Rural West initiative. The initiative will examine challenges and opportunities in rural economic and community development with the goal of recommending policy changes and best practices to support vibrant and enduring rural and tribal communities in the West. The initiative will use regional workshops and policy-centric webinars to examine challenges and opportunities in the rural West. We've already hosted 2 regional workshops in Fargo, North Dakota, and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and have upcoming workshops scheduled in Idaho and Oregon on December 3rd and March 19th and 20th, respectively. If you would like more information about these workshops, please visit our website or reach out to me at kmoss@westgov.org. A key pillar of Governor Burgum's initiative is connectivity for rural and tribal communities. Digital connectivity and high-speed broadband are the critical infrastructure of the 21st century, supporting economic development, distance learning, and telehealth applications across the country. This initiative will identify strategies and policy opportunities to accelerate the deployment of broadband to rural and tribal areas. Today's speakers represent tribal nations and communities across the West. They are going to discuss particular challenges that tribal communities face in terms of deploying advanced broadband infrastructure and highlight programmatic and policy opportunities that tribal nations, states, governors, and federal agencies can take to accelerate the deployment of broadband infrastructure to tribal areas. To begin the conversation, each speaker will introduce themselves, their organization, and the particular issues they work on. Matt Rantanen, today's moderator, will then lead a thorough moderated discussion of various topics, such as middle-mile fiber infrastructure challenges and how creative uses of wireless spectrum can provide tribal nations with a valuable connectivity resource. Matt will also be incorporating your questions to inform the discussion. To send in questions, please use the chat box function on the left side of the screen and address them to the presenters. You may send questions in at any point, and I will pass them over to Matt for his use in leading the discussion. I would also like to thank our generous initiative sponsors for supporting today's discussion. These sponsors include Grow with Google, Western Governors University, and Walker Consulting, and America's Small Business Development Centers. Thank you again for tuning in, and at this point, I'll turn it over to Matt to introduce our panelists and get us started.
Thanks, Kevin. So my name is Matt Rantanen. I am the Director of Technology for Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association. I run the Tribal Digital Village Network here that serves 20 federally recognized tribes using microwave and solar panels and access to fiber to deliver services to the 20 communities. I'm also the Director of Development, Government and Community Outreach for Arcadian Infracom, a fiber infrastructure builder. And I sit on the Tech and Telecom Subcommittee at the National Congress of American Indians with one of our guests, Geoffrey Blackwell. And I also help them manage their technology task force. I help advise the state of California's Broadband Council, and I work with, obviously, with the Western Governors Association to talk about tribal issues in the rural West about connectivity. And so I'd like to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to start with Danae Wilson, who is the manager of the Nez Perce Tribe's Department of Technology Services. Danae, can you give us a few minutes about yourself?
Hi, I work for the Nez Perce Tribe in North Central Idaho, and I'm also hold many national and local, regional committee positions advancing technology and communications connectivity in Indian country, and I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Danae. And Mariel Triggs, the CEO of MuralNet.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mariel Triggs. I run a small nonprofit out of Silicon Valley, and what we do is we help tribal communities deploy their own private LTE community networks to bring broadband to their lands.
Great. Let's see. And then we'll switch over to Geoffrey Blackwell, the Chief Strategy Officer and General Counsel at AMERIND Risk.
Thanks, Matt. My name is Jeff Blackwell. I'm a manager for a federally chartered, tribally owned corporation that provides risk management and insurance to about 400 tribal nations. We have 3 charter tribes: the Red Lake Band of Ojibwe, the Confederated Tribes of the Sayosh and Kootenai, and the Pueblo of Santa Ana. And I, as Chief Strategy Officer, I am involved in strategic innovation for our company. And as General Counsel, I'm the head of the legal team for our company. We a couple years ago, 3 years ago, we started a broadband division called AMERIND Critical Infrastructure that helps tribes access larger federal funding and coordinate major deployment planning. I'm a former FCC senior manager. I had 2 tours of duty at the Federal Communications Commission in Washington, D.C. I was the first tribal member to ever work for the FCC starting in 2000, and went back to the FCC after about 6 years, went to work back in Indian country, and then went back to the commission in 2010 and became the founding chief of the Office of Native Affairs and Policy at the FCC. And during those 2 separate tours of duty, I worked on the FCC's seminal tribal policies and programs, including all of the Universal Service Fund programs and carrier designations. I worked on spectrum licensing, both for broadband and broadcast, tower siting and environmental regulations, radio, TV, and satellite, as well as other sort of enforcement and adjudicatory matters. As Matt said, he and I are actually co-chairs of the National Congress of American Indians Technology and Telecommunications Subcommittee. I also have the honor of co-chairing the National Congress of American Indians Economic Finance and Community Development Committee. I vice chair the board of tribal advisors to Arizona State University, their American Indian Policy Institute. And I formerly served on some boards, National Small Business Association, National Federation of Community Broadcasters, Native Public Media, and Acoma Pueblo Business Enterprises. I'm very active in the policymaking, advising folks on Capitol Hill or in various state houses and companies and tribal nations alike. It's a real honor to be back with WGA. I want to thank the sponsors. When I was a Fed, I came out to multiple WGA meetings in different capacities at the FCC and got to know some folks in WGA a while back when I worked in the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. So thank you very much for the invite. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Jeff. So it always reminds me of how much we're out there doing, and we forget to announce because it's helpful from perspective of the listeners to know where we're involved. So I did 2 tours on the Native Nations Broadband Task Force, which has changed its name, and I believe, Danae, you're on the current iteration of that. Can you give a few more of the associations that you're actually involved with, like such as your AT&I involvement as well as the FCC?
Sure. I'm currently the committee co-chair of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Telecommunications and Technology Committee. My co-chair, the other co-chair partner is Crystal Hottaway, and she's from Makah. So the 2 of us together chair the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Technology and Telecommunications Committee. I am currently the chair of the Native Nations Communications Task Force, the latest iteration of the FCC Broadband Task Force. And so I co-chair that with Matthew Duchesne, the bureau chief, or the office chief, excuse me. I am also the co-chair for the FirstNet Tribal Working Group, and co-chair that with a partner out of Alaska. I am on the Native Public Media Station Advisory Board, and so I have been serving there for a couple of years. I just recently completed a term on the FCC Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, and I completed a term on the Idaho Broadband Task Force recently.
Thank you very much. That definitely spells out how involved we are. Having also been on CISRIC 4 for the FCC Communications Security Reliability and Interoperability Council, that was crazy. And then all of the stuff that I'm doing with the state of California, and having been on Native Public Media's board chair twice. And, we're definitely well-rounded in this space. We do a lot of policy work together, actually, for those that are on the call. And know each other fairly well. We just came back from an Indigenous Connectivity Summit hosted by Internet Society, and then actually were able to perform a small community network build, partnering between Internet Society and MuralNet, and we're able to get a community actually so well versed in what they're doing to take over the build and build it themselves the last 2 of 3 days of the build. So we've been interested in helping communities and growing these opportunities, and we're going to get into some of the topics today about what the barriers to entry are and some of the complications that we're working with and solutions for getting connectivity into Indian country and the rural West, if you will. So I think the first thing that I would like to illustrate, and I can have some of our speakers back me up, but I would like to illustrate that there is a connectivity challenge in tribal areas in the United States based on builds of fiber networks that happened almost 20 years ago, some of them a little longer than 20 years ago. And there was a race to build fiber in the United States from east to west, from a little bit north to south. And in doing so, these companies were valued by the number of feet that they could put in the ground in a day. And the value of the company grew, the speed at which they deployed grew, but they were not looking at the people in Middle America. They were looking to get from the West Coast to the East Coast and from NFL city to NFL city. They were not really concerned about the folks that lie in between those population densities. So they built around a lot of obstacles. They built around the Grand Canyon. They built around most of the Rockies and any large obstacle that's geographical on that in that nature. They also built around tribal reservations because it was another hurdle for them to work with a sovereign tribal government to try to understand their version of rights of way and easement. So in the last presidential administration, I was lucky enough to work with a group with the CTO of the United States and actually do a mapping project to identify missing middle mile fiber that would connect reservations to the grid of infrastructure that supports the USA's internet. And that final number came up at 8,000 missing miles of middle mile fiber. And so I can guarantee that each of us can talk about the fact that we're working on a project that doesn't have access to middle mile fiber. But I would like to ask Danae, in her experience in Idaho with her tribe, and then some of her experience with AT&I, have you run into these issues in your deployments?
We've had several struggles in our deployments. Probably the most significant has, or at least took the longest, was developing a right-of-way use agreement with the state of Idaho. That took about 8 years. We have it now. We're deploying fiber within the right-of-way off reservation to connect outside of the region, which has been really great for us. That'll be 21 miles. We've been deploying fiber, but we've been doing very short runs, 3 miles, 9 miles. Of course, the cost of running fiber in Idaho is fairly expensive per mile simply because of the terrain. We have a lot of rock, a lot of draws, creeks, rivers, bridge work. So deploying fiber in Idaho is fairly expensive. But for our particular region, fiber deployment is absolutely necessary for us to get the type of middle mile and definitely first mile, the large pipeline outside of the region. So that's what we've been doing in North Central Idaho. A lot of the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, our member tribes, have had difficulties working agreements with providers or states or landowners in developing and deploying fiber. Some are further along than others, and many of us, like NESPER, still rely on microwave point-to-point towers. We have, NESPER's tribe has 22 towers, and we still rely very heavily upon that technology because fiber deployment is so expensive.
Great, thank you. And so, Mariel, I'm gonna switch over to you, and I'm going to sort of tee you up on a question here about access to fiber, and I know your solution in some of your cases is a wireless backhaul, which we will get into a little bit later. But I wondered if you had experience with just trying to identify where fiber assets are to use backhaul with the builds that you're doing.
Well, a lot of our community had figured out some way to get the middle mile built out to their either tribal government or library or some other type of anchor institution, maybe a tribal college or something of that sort. So with what we do is we help with that first mile to get the connection to homes. And what that means is, for lack of a better word, we put up a sprinkler head and we can change out the hose. Obviously the fiber hose is preferred, but what we often have to use is microwave. What we find with our fiber feeds when we have them is they often have very constricted use based off of the contracts that were made. And oftentimes our partners didn't even necessarily think about what these contracts were limiting them and what they could do. Oftentimes also the tribal governments got grants from the federal government to build out that middle mile, but then they just handed over that money to an outside provider. That outside provider then extends their own network, basically building out their own infrastructure subsidized by the tribal government's work. And then they have a monopoly within the community.
Yeah, this segues perfectly into my question for Jeff is, so what are some of the solutions, Jeff, to solve some of these fiber challenges? And, you know, obviously AMERIND's critical infrastructure division is working on these types of programs, but can you highlight how to get around some of that missing middle mile fiber component?
So I think it is the way that one approaches the field. A lot of the deployment that you referred to that happened 20 years ago in the fiber world was trying to get from a large population density to another large population density. So the first step is really taking stock of the areas that we're talking about and what their strengths are. Something that Mariel just mentioned is very important. Engaging core institutions in rural America and certainly in tribal lands. So it's something. It's a regulatory term that gets talked about every now and then. It's aggregating demand. It is trying, rather than necessarily approaching the issue as trying to artificially create an amount of competition, recognizing that there aren't large population densities, but there are key users. So one of the programs that I think AMERIND Critical Infrastructure obviously knows a lot about, because there are a couple of former FCC managers that work here, is the E-rate program. Now, this is a famous program. It's been around for a long time at the FCC, and for a long time it paid for a lot of the connectivity to schools and libraries. And in the most recent review and adoption of new rules for that program for broadband services, there was an additional $1.5 billion put in there for fiber to schools and libraries. So several of the projects that ACI, that our critical infrastructure division has been involved in, are connecting those core community institutions. And what tribal nations have done in these consortiums or in these long-haul runs between tribes through parts of Indian country here in New Mexico and in other parts of the United States, in Arizona and in Minnesota and Alaska, are connecting these core community institutions. And then while that infrastructure is being laid, the tribal nation has put in its own conduit and at its own expense has put in fiber, planning to blow fiber through. So it's really about trying to find the most efficient use of funding and then maximizing the opportunity once that ground is open. I think it's also worth it to step back for a second and just make sure that the terminology that we're using, that the folks who are participating in the webinar really understand what we mean when we say middle mile fiber. There's a bunch of other stuff I'm sure that'll come out in the course of the call, but the first idea that I would offer is this idea of aggregation demand and engaging core community institutions, not necessarily looking for competitive entry based on population density. At the same time, there are many folks, many companies who do not want to go into these areas. So our tribal nations, like Danae's, find themselves in the position of becoming the de facto carrier of last resort. And it's been very helpful. We've seen in certain states when the state recognizes this and, sets a table where the tribal nations and the state can sit down, take a look at maps and data, what the resources are and what each other has, and then sort of try to create a higher level plan. But I would throw it back to you, Matt, to make sure that we're on the same page with our listeners about what we mean when we say middle mile fiber.
Okay. So thanks, Jeff. The middle mile fiber, just a simple definition, is to get, so those of you who have access to the actual webinar and are not calling in, please look at the graphic on the screen. It's a map of the lower 48, and it shows approximately 95% of the fiber routes that are built in the United States. And you can see that there are giant holes in that map that are, as large as sometimes 2 states, or, half of 4 states, or like half of a really large state that has a large population. And those regions are actually quite identical to where the tribes are actually allocated with their reservations. The middle mile fiber component would connect you from the yellow lines that are on that map, which are the long haul, big fiber trunks that move around the United States, to your actual community. And then the first mile, which the people-centered voice, both Mariel and I, and I think Jeff and Danae as well, also think about the people first. And we're trying to twist what they call the last mile. It's not. It's really the first mile. That middle mile fiber gives you an opportunity to get to the rest of the world. The community side of that middle mile fiber connects to your local area network that supports your community. And this graphic is I don't know how many years old, but it's very representative, sorry, of kind of those giant holes that are unserved in the United States. So I would like to talk a little bit about some other solutions that we are developing because of the lack of this infrastructure and the lack of the service to the homes in these communities, and the lack of just opportunity in rural America. Several of us are working on rural solutions that support communities, and I think there's an opportunity currently that's happening right now that affects all of us, and we'll get into that really heavily. Mariel is leading the charge with MuralNet on some of the issues there. But I would like to ask Danae to just kind of do an overview of what their network might look like in Nez Perce.
So I just wanted to point out, if you take a look at this map and look at Idaho specifically, that piece in the middle that has no yellow lines, that's exactly where I'm at.
Exactly.
I just want to point that out. That's where I'm at. That's where I'm building. And if you take a look at Montana, all across that northern border there, that's where all the tribes are located at. If you look at New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, that corner, that's where Navajo Nation is, and they are literally in that entire unconnected yellow space. So when you think about Indian country and you think about working with Native nations, the issue really is that we have no connection to any of the major pipelines. And so any of those connections that we have to build in order for us to get connected to any of those middle mile or any of that larger pipe really is a tribally led effort, because nobody else is coming to us. And even my state, clearly you can see my state is not connected north to south. We are looking at building regional optic networks. Tribes have been doing it. Chickasaw Nation just put in 500 miles, or will be finishing that 500 miles, connecting significant parts of Oklahoma. And you'll see they are in some of that no yellow line places. So I want to point that out before I get into some of the solutions. Where Native nations are located at is where we have 0 yellow lines. So that's the number one. This map is really great for that, and it is really at the tribal nations' expense and at the tribal nations' interest to build those connections to those larger pipelines in order to provide high-speed connectivity. While doing so, though, we're elevating our entire regions. It's not an exclusive network. The fiber I'm putting in is benefiting the Forest Service, the Park Service, the state. Many businesses along our route are utilizing our services. Cellular companies have come to us and asked to lease those strands of fiber to build out their networks. So wherever tribes are building regional optic networks, it definitely is elevating the entire region, not just the nation. And so for Nez Perce, as an example, and Coeur d'Alene, who's just north of me, they're deploying massive amount of fiber and are looking to make those bigger pipe connections. So however you want to name it, but that middle mile connection is really absolutely necessary for us. Makes no sense to invest all this money in a fiber optic network and have it connect to low speed or minimal speeds. And so definitely tribes are making every effort to make that connection. And in almost every state where there's no yellow lines, I can guarantee you there's a reservation. It would be really interesting to lay the reservation layer over this so you can see, but everywhere the yellow lines aren't, that's where you have a Native nation, and that's where we're building. Sorry, Matt, if I got too far off on a tangent.
Oh, that's fine. It just definitely illustrates what we're dealing with. And I do see in the chat that a couple of folks have posted that there are some missing components of this fiber, and I just did want to, remind folks that I did say it's about 95% correct. I know there's new builds that are in different locations. There was one that was identified that's in Northwest, Northwest Montana, and I know there's one that runs up 395 in California that's not represented on this as well, but it is fairly representative of the situation, and it's not that old. And one of the problems that we ran into in this study was actually collecting the data. And so you have a component of the government that feels that this is critical infrastructure, which we believe, yes, it is. Maybe not at the local area, but definitely some of the fiber trunks that cross the United States, it actually is valuable infrastructure for the operations of the actual country. So it's hard to get access to these without a non-disclosure agreement. Then once you get a non-disclosure agreement, you actually can't produce the map. This was actually produced and posted by Business Insider. I believe it was a study out of a university, and it's easily findable if you search, national broadband map or national, fiber infrastructure map, and you can find a lot of references to it. So it is illustrative of what we're dealing with today. So I wanted to now kind of pivot and just have Jeff answer a couple things about AMERIND critical infrastructure, and then we'll get into the issue at hand, which is a spectrum issue coming up. So Jeff, can you tie a little bit of this to AMERIND's critical infrastructure and some of the work you're doing with I think double digits in tribes now?
Yeah, so we've helped tribal nations get about 12 million for middle mile fiber from different sources, and then help them use that efficiently in working with the states. But the perspective I want to share is really one that comes out of the last 20 years of work. I was working as a federal regulator, working as a tribal manager, working as a tribal business person. The relevance of middle mile fiber, there's a couple points I just want to make quickly, and I think it'll actually help Danae and Mariel in the discussion of, as we transition to discussion of the spectrum opportunities that are out there. Right now, so even 10 years ago, no one expected the enormous proliferation of wireless services throughout the United States. And when you say connectivity to your average American, they think their phone. There's an old joke that tribal leaders use about how you knew you were getting into Indian country when you started hitting potholes in the road. Well, now the joke is you know you're getting into Indian country when you have a dropped phone call. And what most people don't understand or have a complete understanding of, except for engineers and practice experienced folks like Danae and Mariel and Matt, is the intersection of the needs for power, fiber, and wireless spectrum. So the reason why middle mile fiber is such an important priority for our tribal nations here at AMERIND is they know that it's upon that middle mile fiber that the most robust wireless networks can also be built. That will help in the overcoming the obstacles of point-to-point microwave and the limitations there. They also know that there are very few federal resources that are directed towards fiber, middle mile fiber. Very few state resources that are directed towards middle mile fiber, because a majority of those programs were addressed at that last mile, or as we're saying here, the first mile. It's really about getting from the distribution point to the home. That's where a lot of the federal universal service programs are aimed. So over the course of the developments at the FCC over the last 15 years, particularly the last 10 in overhauling the universal service subsidies and upgrading them for connectivity, not just telephony. The idea of this importance for middle mile fiber is only going to get more and more prevalent across the western states. If you drive by any tower, what makes these wonderful supercomputers that we carry in our pockets and in our purses is a large amount of fiber going and power going to those towers so that they can maximize the efficiency and the use of the spectrum that is coming off them. And that, with the growth of the ideas around 5G and the continuing deployment of 4G LTE and other wireless services, and more folks carrying, 2, 3, 4, 5 wireless devices, the importance of focusing on middle mile fiber, really can't be, it can't be overstated. So thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. So that really illustrates the point that came out of the American Indian Policy Institute at Arizona State University study that just happened, which I'm also on the board with Geoffrey. That study actually showed that there was a very heavy use of handheld devices, phones and iPads and things like that, and it almost skewed the results of the study to make it seem like tribes would prefer that as a connectivity potential. But reality is tribes are very adaptive, and when they get access to a platform, they excel on that platform. So they have access to wireless in some of their communities, and some of the people the cross section of folks that answered this survey had access to wireless, and it was very obvious that they knew how to use it once they got a hold of it. What it did illustrate too is that there was a definite lack of wireline services to the home and connectivity at the home, because there was still a struggle in the homework gap of actually being able to perform functions on homework. So I'm going to now ask Mariel to step into solutions that maybe step away from fiber and present opportunities in very unique communities where she has had the opportunity to deploy. Mariel, take it away.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much. And I apologize. I don't know if my map will be able to show up, but it's available on our website to MuralNet.org. What we did 2 years ago, we were an all-volunteer organization, and we worked with the Havasupai tribe. They are a tribe at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. They're known to be the most remote community outside of Alaska. And we worked with them to bring broadband to the residents of their village. It was essentially this confluence in 2017 of open source software to run a network, of all the backhaul that people like Danae and Matt and Jeff and Valerie Fastforce have built, cheap equipment that was reliable suddenly becoming available. And the fact is that there is the infrastructure in the United States that our sister organizations in, say, Africa and Southeast Asia don't necessarily have. So the problem on tribal lands in the US was totally addressable. The missing thing was spectrum, because we felt wireless LTE networks, 4G was going to be a great answer to bridging the digital divide in Indian country. My founder, Martin Casado, he actually went slice by slice through all the FCC bands in the desirable frequency ranges. And what he found was there's this pretty much forgotten band called Educational Broadband Service Spectrum in the 2.5 gigahertz band. And what's great about this, it's almost the perfect balance for rural deployment. You get great propagation. It can go very far. It can penetrate through foliage. Leaves aren't so much of an issue. And it has a good balance of distance. We normally put up networks that are 40 feet off the ground, and you can get a couple miles out of that. You get it up 70 or 80 feet, you're looking at 4 to 6 miles. And I have a colleague who said that he was able to get 13 miles by putting it up even higher. I must admit, I'm waiting to see it. And I've asked him what the typical size of a fish he catches as well. But basically, if you have a fiber pop, backhaul, a microwave link, even satellite, this would distribute it pretty evenly and pretty cheaply across a community. With the Havasupai, it took us half a day to put up the equipment on existing infrastructure. It cost less than $15,000 to go ahead and do it. And the network interfaces we're using that was open source was so easy that you only have to be tech savvy. You don't have to have 2 engineering degrees from Berkeley or something like that in order to operate it. Folks could operate their networks with just a few short trainings. So what that meant is we found a pretty cool solution to the connectivity problem, but it was all based off of using this prime spectrum. The spectrum was originally for educational use back in the 80s, but what ended up happening is build-out requirements changed when cellular phones became more prominent and broadband came around. And the schools that held the licenses no longer could meet the build-out requirements. So a lot of them ended up leasing it out to Sprint. 71% of leases are actually held by Sprint. Leasing got kind of crazy. So what ended up happening is in the 90s, they froze licensing. And licensing had been frozen. Actually, technically, it is still frozen right now. So you're looking at over 20 years. In that time, all sorts of different bands were coming, all sorts of limitations. A lot of the accessible bands for unlicensed, for example, are limited at 1 watt. But this old forgotten band, it had power requirements of 40 watts in its mid. So this thing could really scream. It's just that a lot of people have forgotten about it. So we found a backdoor way to get access to the spectrum for the Havasupai tribe. And we thought it would take 2 weeks to get that license so that they can broadcast through a special temporary authorization, but it ended up taking 4 months. However, once they got the approval, and the network went up in half a day, it was a proof of concept that was important. And based off of what the FCC saw with the Havasupai tribe's network, and based off of the long and strong efforts for the last year and a half by the Havasupai tribe, and specifically Councilwoman Ophelia Wadahamaji Corliss, what's going to end up happening is a tribal priority window in which tribal communities can claim unlicensed spectrum over their land for free. Now, to understand the magnitude of this, a recent auction of spectrum, I think it was an incentive auction, garnered $20 billion for the federal government. So this is something that is phenomenal. The problem with it is that it takes a long time to educate folks about what spectrum could do for them. You can talk about it as real estate in the sky and relate it to sovereign rights. You can talk about what the Havasupai tribe did with it. They created distance learning opportunities. Students in the village could, for the first time, take in real-time math classes. The local school only goes up to 8th grade, so if anyone wants to pursue a high school diploma, they have to go to boarding school. And at 14-year-olds having to leave their home and everything they've known in the canyon walls, a lot of them don't do well in boarding school, and they come back dejected, thinking that they're not worth anything. So this was a huge opportunity. The Havasupai will be building a clinic next year, and telemedicine's finally going to be possible. For decades, people have been telling them that the telemedicine is going to be the answer to their health woes. But all the equipment that has been sent, and there's tons of equipment that has been sent over the last decade, it doesn't work if you don't have connectivity. So when it comes to educating folks, it takes a while. Spectrum's really kind of an obtuse concept. Unfortunately, the FCC currently is considering starting this window in January for tribes to claim spectrum, and it could be as short as 60 days. Our experience is that it takes 5 to 10 months working with the tribal government in order to get folks to realize the magnitude of this opportunity and to pass a tribal resolution to get the spectrum. So this is especially affecting Western states. There's about 514 tribal lands that have spectrum available. It's about 2 million people that could be connected using this spectrum. Right now, we're in the middle of rulemaking. Some rules are almost set. We have eligible lands, and there's maps on our website that you can see what lands are eligible. What is the problem is in 2 of the states, both Alaska and in Hawaii, there are eligible lands, but not necessarily all the eligible claimants that can apply for the spectrum. So for example, only federally recognized tribes can apply for spectrum, and that doesn't include Native Hawaiians. Alaskan corporations are also not included. So one of the asks that I would have is, if you can, could you please write to Chairman Pai and tell them that these communities should be allowed to claim the spectrum that is available over the tribal lands. It is seriously an oversight on the part of the FCC, and they need that proof of interest on the record. Unfortunately, for those specific entities, you only have till Monday to submit something to Chairman Pai. So if you need any help with that, please reach out to me. Another thing is outreach is hard. Travel costs are expensive. The FCC is doing what it can with these regional meetings and going to different conferences and such, but the tribes with less resources that need the spectrum the most in order to connect their people are also the least likely to be able to afford to send people to these meetings. So statewide or local outreach events would be really, really helpful. We can help with speakers, we can help with other types of supports, but to be able to host those outreach events so that we can minimize travel costs and perhaps even supplement travel costs would be a huge help in getting the word out about this spectrum. And lastly, there's something, oh, go ahead.
Can I interject for a second? I'll come right back to you, but I want to just get a perspective from Jeff, having done 2 terms at the FCC. I'll come right back to you, so hold that thought. Jeff, can you give us a little piece about the tribal priority window that's happening here and why that came about? And then also potentially what it means to engage with the Fed on policy. And Mariel touched on the fact that it's tough to do that sometimes, and how relevant that is to an organization like the FCC. And do they actually read your comments?
Wow. Okay, I'll try to do that real quick. So first, I think Mariel has really done a good job of hitting the high points about this educational broadband service, the 2.5 gigahertz. The idea of the way that CMRS, commercial mobile radio services, this spectrum is licensed by the FCC is by a highest bidder wins auction. That's sort of the backdrop to the stage that we're talking about right now. And 10 years ago, the FCC first adopted rules for a tribal priority in licensing for broadcast radio, for over-the-air radio in the FM, AM, low-power FM bands. And the concept of the priority is drawing upon the role of tribal governments and their the requirements that they have to provide services to their people, to get services out onto tribal lands. So the FCC developed a mechanism, and I'm proud to say I was there at the time, that utilized a different type of licensing mechanism rather than an auction. It was a threshold window qualification criteria. Now, that's been in place for a while. The full power, there are a number of tribes that have used a tribal priority to build full power FM radio stations. I think we may be in the double digits of tribes that have taken the opportunity of those rules that have been in place since 2011. But this is the first time, Mariel's spot on, this is the first time it's ever happened in this area of spectrum for these particular purposes to deploy wireless broadband networks for mobile services. And as far as outreach, so tribal nations are remote, communities that have, that in many ways resemble state governments, but maybe at a smaller size. But they have sovereignty that approaches international sovereignty, and they have a direct relationship with the federal government. So it's it's an organization, the FCC, the commission is really, for the vast part of its history, was oriented towards corporations, not governments, whether they be tribal, state, local, or municipal, or county or city governments. The FCC created the Office of Native Affairs and Policy to do outreach to tribal nations, but that is a higher level of order because we have over 570 tribes in the United States, including 229 in Alaska, 100 in California. There are 21 here in New Mexico and scattered throughout the western United States. The outreach associated with this 2.5 gigahertz tribal priority window, it's just simply moving too quickly for enough of the coordination and the training to be able to take place. This came out of, it's not just Mariel and my opinion, it's the opinion of many tribal governments and tribal representatives who came together at the big National Congress of American Indians conference. We adopted a resolution there to request that the commission, go a little bit slower and get this right, take their time and get this right. We learned that they had identified to the Office of Management and Budget that they thought that only 8 tribal nations would take advantage of this opportunity. We believe that many more will, and a lot of rural America could potentially benefit at the same time if there was proper time given for outreach and then also a larger window. The build-out requirement on the other side is 5 years, but to open a 90-day window for this kind of opportunity is, it's moving very quickly. It's moving too quickly. As far as advocacy before the FCC, the third part of your question, absolutely, it certainly helps. We've been made aware that there's a letter that's gone from 3 United States senators on Monday, went to Chairman Pai and the commission, asking them for more details about the outreach and the process and more time, and specifically referencing the NCAI resolution and supporting its elements. That was from Senator Udall, Senator Brian Schatz, and Senator Lisa Murkowski, and so a bipartisan letter. I do think that the FCC has the resources to do the outreach. It's a matter of prioritizing it and really understanding how to engage. I think it's wonderful what Mariel is doing, and I really admire MuralNet's work. But I do think that if governors of the western states who have tribal nations as part of their constituencies and who see the potential of working with tribal nations in these sorts of opportunities in this entire neighborhood of areas, if they were to let the FCC know that they would like the tribal nations afforded more time and opportunity, it would be in everybody's benefit, and it would resonate at the FCC. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. That's exactly what I was looking for. There is a great amount of value in getting our voice on the record, and the FCC has told me repeatedly that they're required to read every word and take it into account. So, you have positions at the state level to be able to influence the federal level, and that is one of the, I think, most powerful tools we're afforded. I wanted to alert everybody that's on the chat that we actually have a slide up for the use of available EBS spectrum in the, affecting the Western Governors Association states. And I will send it back to Mariel to talk a little bit about this and finish her thoughts on this subject.
Great, thank you. So what we run into, there's a few specific issues that goes on because it's tribal communities that can claim it are the governments, but also majority-owned tribal entities. But what I really want to illustrate here is how much spectrum is available. This is a huge swath of spectrum, 117.5 gigahertz. I'm sorry, megahertz, although if it was gigahertz, I'd take it. What that means is we can build a network on just 10 megahertz. So what you end up here is you can actually have different networks on the same LAN. So you can have multiple. You can have one dedicated to emergency response, another one that's dedicated to telemedicine, another one that's dedicated to maybe a tribally owned ISP that's starting up. So there's a lot that can happen there. And what needs to be done, and what my experience has been when it comes to doing outreach, is helping folks to figure out a way to claim all the spectrum and then doling it out afterwards and figuring out best use. MuralNet will help with all legal fees. It's actually a pretty easy application. We do educational outreach. We can also help get networks started, including trainings. And we are also looking to start programs to help apply for funding from the federal government. What's nice about this is, while this part is cheap, relatively, we're talking $10, $15, $20, $30,000 to start the network. It can often be married with applications to the federal government for bigger networks, which would be very helpful in getting that backhaul, getting that middle mile, getting that connection to the internet backbone. So I really like to pair those things. One of our best partners in outreach has actually been state agencies. For example, the California Public Utility Commission. And what the states can do with outreach, what the states can do with support is huge. And I would really appreciate it if you can reach out and let me know if you're open to working together.
I would just like to dovetail in right there about the CPUC in California. They are actually actively working with tribes, and Commissioner Guzman Aceves has taken a hard look at some of the existing phone connection options and subsidies that support California residents, independent of the federal subsidies that can be used for those same connections, and is looking at an application for using them for broadband, and what does that mean for tribal connectivity. And it has been a very good process about opening up doors and potential state-supported matches of federal programs as well. I think I'd like to touch a little bit. We're going to get into more discussion about spectrum in a moment, but I think I'd like to touch a little bit on what federal programs are working best for folks and in the deployment of things. And I have my list, but I believe Danae and Mariel and Jeff probably have different lists. But I'd like to start with Danae. What federal programs are working for you, and maybe what federal programs could use a little bit of a tweak to make them work with tribes better, and how might that be?
So Nez Perce Tribe has been building its microwave network out for many years, and we used a multitude of different type of funding sources. We've used USDA's RBAG and RBOG. We've used Community Connect funds. We've used Idaho GEM funds, which have helped us with match and deploying larger sections of our network. We've also done probably the most significant amount of funding that came into Indian country, at least in the Pacific Northwest, and for the tribes who were able to capitalize on the opportunity was underneath the American Reinvestment ARA. I can't remember what it exactly stands for. Somebody else can jump in, but we were
Reinvestment and Recovery Act.
there you go. Thank you very much. We were a B-top awardee, so we were on the grant and grant side. Many tribes went on a grant loan, and many tribes have used USDA loan programs to build out their networks or to build out their telecommunications infrastructure. Nez Perce Tribe has been very fortunate. We continue to use grant resources. Homeland Security is another grant who helps do generators, fencing, roads, that type of thing. So we continually apply for and are have been lucky enough to be awarded under Homeland Security for some of our infrastructure needs. There are grants that I think would have been extremely beneficial to us that we weren't able to, even though we were selected as an awardee, we weren't able to deploy under. One of them was EDA's Public Works grant. And that particular grant was going to run 21 miles of fiber for the tribe. But at that time, Idaho and the tribe didn't have an agreement. That was $2.5 million federal funds under a grant that we had to essentially turn back. We couldn't capitalize on that investment because the state was getting equal benefit to the tribe. And in that meant the state had to be our co-applicant. And so if you're deploying, whether it's microwave or fiber, there are a multitude of grants available. Well, there were, I guess, because USDA's application process has become so stringent. I do think that's a great funding source, but I do think some of that has to change. Telecommunication companies have benefited significantly from CAF and CAF2, our mobility fund for cellular companies. The issue has been that under those funding agencies, tribes are typically the last build areas. And where I see improvements to those particular grants is to change that model from the most difficult build coming at the last or the piece that they can write off. Those funding agencies should have the most difficult build be the first segment of the network built out, which would then include tribal nations. So there are some things that can be done to help investment in Native nations and also encourage telecommunication companies, all of the major carriers, to build on tribal lands first. And so definitely switching that model from the most difficult last to putting the most difficult first would definitely be a great opportunity to advance communications in tribal nations.
Very good, thank you. So we have a similar path at the Tribal Digital Village Network in Southern California. We were actually lucky enough in the very, very beginning, in the inception process, to have a relationship with the University of California, San Diego, the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, some technology stuff that was being done through a National Science Foundation grant with HPREN, which is High Performance Wireless Research and Education Network, and an opportunity from basically a computer manufacturer, Hewlett Packard, that was doing philanthropy back in the day, married that all together and landed the initial grant that started this whole project. But since then, we have accessed rural utility services funds and the distance learning and telemedicine side. We've gotten 2 foundation funds from California internal. We continue to align with different projects and opportunities in California and benefit from some of the funding that they get and some of the work that they get. And it's just a multitude of things that make this happen. One of the things that we also implemented is instituting, a sustainability component in the development of our program, so that we are less reliable or less restricted in the use of our funding, because a lot of grants come with strings, and we are also more reliant and self-determined, self-controlling because of funding coming in from actual services we sell. And so, as Kevin posted on the chat, and I will reiterate, we are down to our last 30 minutes. So please send in your questions as we move through the last part of this, so that we can address any concerns you have and do it live. So I would like to ask Mariel, with the tribes that she's working with, do you know of any other funding opportunities that we may be overlooking, that you may have identified in support of network building that you've experienced?
NSF funds, if you believe it. A lot of our partners are quite adept at writing grants for NSF, and then that way they can also tap into internet to backhaul, and it's been a fabulous combination. So then they often will put in the line item to build a wireless LTE network to then bridge that gap between whatever it is they're trying to connect, whether it's faculty housing or a soil sensor or a high-speed camera, far off for research purposes, and the campus network.
Thank you for that. So, and then I'd like to touch on what AMERIND Critical Infrastructure is doing. And Jeff, can you touch on the avenues that your director, Irene Flannery, is working on with tribes?
So you mean, let me make sure I understand your question. Do you mean sort of around sort of high-level suggestions for what states can do, and sort of in the policy arena?
Yeah,
and
support in support of those mechanisms, or looking at the Fed and identifying really good opportunities for tribes that may be open right now, such as E-rate, which you use, but then also some that may be there that may need a little bit of help from state influence that might make them easier for their tribes to get access to.
Okay, so E-rate as a program is just one of the programs I mentioned earlier as an example. There are a number of programs that both state and federal that our critical infrastructure division is drawn on, and I guess some practical considerations. I mentioned aggregation demand earlier. One of the best ways to do that is just convening gatherings between, state tribal consultations and planning. We were very fortunate here to be able to host members of the New Mexico legislature, several carriers, tribal leaders, and just to talk about what shared priorities are. Definitely, I heard early on, I think Danae mentioned a working agreement with the state, a rights-of-way use agreement with states. That's critically important. Here in New Mexico, the rights-of-way that are associated with the New Mexico Department of Transportation are handled at a regional level, one region of New Mexico to another region of New Mexico to another region of Mexico. That's just one example of having to go through multiple state departments. So if the role of state offices, the role of broadband was elevated and prioritized, and in some ways these use agreements were streamlined, that would be very helpful. One can think about that also in terms of the other kinds of environmental or historic preservation reviews. I will tell you, looking ahead, I'll take a little bit of a different, drawing upon my federal experience and tribal government experience. There is a program at the FCC that has been under fire for the better part of a decade now, and it's a program that addresses affordability. A lot of rural America wasn't was overlooked in deployment, not just because of population density, but also because of relative affluence to other populations in the United States, other larger cities. So the Lifeline program at the FCC, it was initially designed to help people to make lower income consumers, middle income consumers for their telephony dollar. And when the Lifeline program in around 2011, 2012 was transitioned over and the rules were changed for broadband, it's been criticized. There was a lot of fraud, waste, and abuse, particularly in densely populated Indian country states that had densely populated Indian country, like Oklahoma. And in addition to enforcement actions, the program was changed. And now one of the concerns, and we also see it in the EBS rules, is that it is only unserved or lower or unserved tribal lands that now qualify as tribal land. So there are these controversies and political on policy differences of opinion, but remains this governmental mission around the question of what should government be doing in places where the cost of services to the consumer is significant, and we need to discuss as a nation, and governments need to discuss, state governments need to discuss what they're going to do with their universal service funds and the Lifeline dollars. If that program is under such fire that it's going to go away, where does that government value go? How do we use the ethic that was behind the Lifeline program now for rural and tribal America? And I will tell you, it's a very important dialogue to be having, especially in places like this, WGA, because it has been proven yet again that Americans, not just Native Americans, but all Americans, will prioritize their connectivity dollar over other basic needs as well. And I'll just end with one anecdote here. There is a tribal, the longest standing, we have 10 fully regulated telcos in the United States. They're tribally owned telcos. They're rural carriers just like any other. The oldest of them is the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota. And the tribal nation saw so many people in their tribe dropping off telephone service during the winter because they were competing. The propane dollar and the heating dollar was competing with the telephone dollar in those tribal households, that the tribal government went out and bought a propane company and then put it under the corporate umbrella of the tribal telco, so that the tribe could help their members get a Lifeline service during the winter months, but then also deliver their propane so that they could help their low-income community manage their income. Now, there is a proposal at the FCC. It was actually rules that were adopted, and then they were proposed rulemakings that were moving forward and then were halted. Something called Lifeline for broadband, and that would be Lifeline for, put it very simply, it's Lifeline for networks that wouldn't be fully blown, regulated networks, full-fledged regulated telcos, if you will, but more community-oriented, local community-oriented, or even governmentally run wireless or internet service providers. So that is something, I think, if we're looking to the future of rural America, this affordability question and how to regulate and support it is important, not just to tribal lands, but the rest of these western states. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. So I have a bit of construction going on near me, so I'm going to keep it short, but I would like to have somebody touch a little bit on what 5G wireless cellular services being built out throughout the United States means And is that a solution for Indian country? I think I'll throw it to Danae first. I'd like to touch on it, but I'll also let both of you have access at it as well. So Danae, what does it mean for Idaho?
Well, right now on Perce, we don't even have full LTE. Even though our phones will say LTE service, the reality is it's 3G enhanced and sometimes not enhanced. So on a large part of our reservation, we don't currently have 3G, and definitely LTE is a problem. Everybody is asking, when is 5G coming? Well, 5G is fiber dependent. So I don't see that happening anytime soon. We are doing some small cell deployment well, we're selling space on our facilities and selling fiber to some of the cellular companies that are looking to do some small cell technology to enhance LTE coverage. So I don't see 5G coming. Definitely many of the Pacific Northwest, many of the AT&I tribes, many people on the Native Nations Communications Task Force. I can tell you that 5G is going to be tough in Indian country. I don't see it happening. We are affiliate members of the National Tribal Telecommunications Association, NTTA, who does a lot of work in Indian country on telecommunications. And I've worked with a lot of tribes who have said 5G isn't coming anytime soon. In rural America in general, without a fiber backhaul, without access to good middle mile connectivity, 5G is not coming.
Thanks, Danae.
Can I give the physics secret behind all this?
Well, yeah, there's a physics secret, and there's just the practicality of the fact that there is not a giant fiber grid that supports this out there. But yeah, go ahead.
Well, 5G is essentially the next way that these devices will talk to each other, radios, phones, and all that. And it's very dependent on its frequency. So when you hear millimeter wave, that's a really high frequency and it can talk really fast. You get great speeds. At mid-band spectrum, say EBS, it's better, but it's nowhere near what you would get at 5G speeds. But it is slightly better than 4G. And when you go down into the low band, it's about the same or can even be slower. So when you think about Indian country, unless I can put up a small cell every 1,000 feet, you're not going to get those throughput speeds that 5G promises.
That's right. So, Jeff, can you give us a little bit of perspective from your view on the 5G deployment and what it means to Indian country?
So yeah, the whole, I mean, at a 50,000 foot level, and I can't go into the engineering details that Mariel can, but at the 50,000 foot level, these things that were once upon a time large towers and antennas and repeaters, now they're the size of large pizza boxes. I mean, if you took something that, if you think about the size of the pizza warming thing that the guy from the pizza delivery place delivers to your house, those are the size of this equipment. And what the FCC recently went through and started about 3 years ago was a licensing rules that would exempt these from the placement of these things, this equipment, from environmental and cultural preservation review processes at the FCC. And there was a large outcry from the tribes and the states. And there were a group of tribes that brought a lawsuit against the FCC, which the FCC won in part and lost in part. I think so. There's still some regulations to be meted out. I don't disagree at all. In fact, I support entirely what my friend Danae says about this. This equipment is really sort of envisions downtowns and large structures and places where there's a lot of fiber and where there's a lot of connectivity, and it almost harkens back to a point in time where there was a lot of discussion in this space around mesh networks. So I think in an environment where we're all still trying to get 4G LTE in rural America, the promise of 5G is one that just can't be envisioned quite yet. There it is. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So we're not putting all our eggs in that basket, is what I'm gathering, and I concur. We have a question from Catherine Bryan on the chat, and that is about having success identifying significant private funders for tribal efforts, and have any of the speakers had any access to to private funding in building out their networks? And I will say from our personal experience here at the Tribal Digital Village Network, we actually have, through relationship building with the folks that are in the policymaking space, have landed on a few private grants. Now they're small, 115,000, 100,000, 50,000, things like that, but they make a difference at certain times during your build, and they can actually really get you like to that next phase or into a technology that you didn't have access to, or things like that. And we've actually had, so for example, People-Centered Internet, run by Malin Fung, David Bray, and Vince Cerf. We have achieved funding from Vince Cerf to support our solar towers with generators to keep quality of service up for our network. We have gotten private funding within California. There's a couple of foundations and things that have provided funding to support test beds to take a look at, what does it look like to connect a tribal home? This is in the past, and obviously we're doing that now. We have almost 400 homes connected, but there are things like that along the way as you get into conversation with folks that are in policy. You start developing these relationships, and there is maybe a small funding mechanism that can support you. But no, it has not been like, hey, giant foundation monster that's worth, or giant private monster that's worth billions of dollars. How about building out this tribal network? We have not had that level of success at all. But Danae, have you? I think you posted in the chat that you have not gone after private investors. Is that correct?
That's correct. We haven't necessarily gone after private investors or foundations or fellowships. What we have done now is develop partnerships. So where I may need match funds for a federal grant, we'll do a partnership with other entities in our region who are interested in being partners with the tribe, and that has been very successful. Recently, we've had, within the last 3 years, we've had interested parties looking to be investors in projects that we're doing. The tribe has preferred to do a partnership instead of simply accepting investment funds, but we definitely are, no amount is too small for us. If I can use pool monies and use those funds to match a federal grant, then it makes a difference. Reconnect, as an example, has a 25% match. So you have to come up with a 25% non-federal match. And sometimes that can be very hard. When you're asking for 25 million, 6 million approximately would need to be non-federal match. And that's a lot of money for somebody to come up with, or any tribe to come up with.
Yeah, that is something I'd like to translate for those state officials that are on the call today. That is one way that states can really help in the federal picture of things, is supporting efforts within your state community that are seeking federal funds with some sort of state level match, because tribes have a federal relationship and a lot of their funding sources are federal. So a federal dollar cannot match a federal dollar. And we come into a situation that if there is not a pool of private funds, or they allow a generous amount of in-kind donation from the work being performed, we have a struggle trying to match some of those federal funds. So that is a good value for the state folks online today to maybe be able to identify some of their state funds that could be, tweaked a little bit to be able to support this. I will say there's another question in the chat that is important. We also have about 8 minutes left before we close out. So we'll address the one, if a tribal government... Go ahead,
Can
Jeff.
I add just a quick footnote to that? So a lot of the things that tribal governments can do with their ability as a sovereign really are bringing a lot of folks to rural America. I'm right here close to Bernalillo, New Mexico. It's actually one of the oldest small towns in the entire country, and it was where the Spanish colonial government established its first base camp. And the tribe here, Santa Ana Pueblo, with what they have developed in terms of their gaming operation, their retail operation, bringing jobs and opportunity, restaurants and things. They're having success working with both the local government and the state government in being something of a mitochondria for redevelopment of this area. So when it comes to, state funds possibly being used as matching funds for federal, there's a lot that could be there in terms of projects and other things that might have broadband attached to it. So thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Good point. So also then I would like to say this question that came into the chat is, if a tribal business or government wants to claim EBS spectrum, how can the tribe request help from MuralNet? And I just wanted Mariel to be able to do that live instead of just in the chat, because I know there's a lot of callers that aren't on the webinar. So Mariel, can you go through those steps, please, in detail so folks that are on the call can actually write them down?
The easiest way to ask for help is to email us at info@muralnet.org. We offer all sorts of services, but what I find is that we do best when we tailor it to who we are speaking with. Oftentimes we're asked to talk with tribal councils, share educational materials, even create educational materials. I got to give a shout out to People-Centered Internet, actually, who funded the creation of our educational materials and the continual updates of them. And also they funded the Havasupai tribe to expand their network so they can start their own tribal ISP. They have a beautiful campground next to them and 30,000 people that visit a year. So what they're going to do is offer hotel rates for folks out in the campgrounds to get internet access. What I find is communities know their resources better than outside organizations, and they can figure out ways to make these networks sustainable. Once again, info@muralnet.org, and that's the best way to get in touch with us.
Thank you, Mariel. I wanted to say too that the Internet Society has opened up their foundation and is starting to look at granting opportunities for planning and development grants to support community builds and community networks, and that'll be happening in the I believe the first quarter of 2020. So we'll keep folks alerted to that. Also, we had a note in the chat about someone who's involved with clean energy efforts in Indian country, and that obviously these things should be layered atop the connectivity piece. And there may be opportunities to tie investors, philanthropists, and people in that space with the connectivity space as they do kind of go hand in hand in managing your resources. So we have about 5 minutes left. So I wanted to reach out for closing comments. And I appreciate all your time here to spend with us today and learn about the issues around the tribes. So Danae, do you have any final comments?
Sorry, I forgot I was on mute. I do. I'm sending some emails out. Definitely anybody that's interested in doing partnerships, are looking to build an Indian country. Again, I'm part of Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians. I'm the co-chair. There's about 67 tribes that are represented, our member tribes of ATNI. We'd be glad to share information. I am the co-chair for the Tribal Working Group for FirstNet, and if you haven't already done so, please do your government-to-government consultation with FirstNet, and Adam or Margaret are perfect contacts. I'll put my email address in the chat so you can get in touch with me, but I definitely think there's some great progress being made in Indian country, and however I can be a part of that is definitely and if I can provide any information is definitely, I'm available.
Thank you, Danae. I'm going to put my email in the chat as well. There was a request for the speaker's emails, and if you would like to do that, please do it yourself. Geoffrey, would you like your email in the chat for folks?
Yeah, that'd be great. It's gblackwell@amerind.com.
All right,
Thanks.
I'm putting it in now. Do you have any final comments, Jeff? We have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to get to Mariel, and I'll drop the last comment.
Yeah, I think we need to promote this opportunity of 2.5 gigahertz. I want to make sure that folks know we'd really like to work together from our committee at NCAI and on events opportunities like this to build a working relationship with WGA. I'd like to extend an invitation on behalf of our committees at NCAI for folks to come from the states and from WGA to come participate. There's a lot of issues that we share in common, and there's a lot of work I think that occurs in other areas, and we should incorporate broadband into it. I would encourage folks to develop a working relationship with the FCC as well, and to make sure that they are allocating part of their time and resources to advocacy for over at the FCC. I will tell you, I helped the FCC build the Consumer and Governmental Affairs Bureau. I was only the second attorney to ever work there, and I helped them build the Consumer Affairs and Outreach Division, the Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, and the Office of Native Affairs and Policy, and I was very honored to be a chief of that office. I would remind folks that it is not as though, because we're talking about rural issues, it is not as though the FCC has a rural ombudsman like many other agencies. So it's important to get involved. With that, I really am honored to be involved in such a distinguished panel, especially with a group of good friends. So thanks so much.
Yeah, this is great. I really appreciate the opportunity and the fact that you all had the time to join in. Mariel, do you have any last comments? We have a couple minutes left, and I'll close it out. And you may be on mute.
Please check out the handout we sent out. It kind of scopes out what the opportunity is within your own state borders. And if you want, we can actually make packets tailored to your state so you know who exactly is eligible and how they're eligible, and we can figure out a strategy to reach out to them.
Okay, so there was a question in the chat. Where's the handout? The handout was linked in the chat. If you scroll up, Kevin posted it in the attendee chat, so you should be able to grab that. I want to thank everybody for joining me on the panel today. Thank Kevin and the Western Governors Association, Governor Burgum, and his initiative to take a look very deeply into connectivity in the rural Western states, because that is where this connectivity is lacking, and that includes all of our tribal communities. And appreciate your time today. And if you have any further questions, we have put all our connectivity there, so please reach out. We're more than happy to share support and work with you on the efforts to make things better in your states. Thank you. Kevin, did you have any last minute?
Nope. I was just going to say that really appreciate everyone's participation, and you've definitely given WJ a lot of regional action items to think about, and also some strategies for our individual governors to consider. So really appreciate all of your conversation. And then this webinar will be posted on our website and our YouTube page, so you can find that and share that after this.
Thanks, Kevin. Thank you, everybody. See you next time.